Dr. Dow, welcome to the Tick Boot Camp podcast.
It's great to be here, Rich. And
Thank
lovely
you.
to meet you.
So first we have to uncover the accent. Where are you from?
I'm Australian originally, and I came to the States in 2000 to do a research postdoc at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in Washington, D.C.
All right. So your pre-postdoc work was done
in Malaria in Australia.
All right.
Yeah.
So give us just a chronology of your education prior to coming to the States.
Yeah, sure. So I was born and grew up in Australia. I have an undergraduate degree in biotechnology, and then I did my PhD in a vet school in malaria drug discovery. So my graduate qualification is technically in veterinary and biomedical sciences. But what I really did was drug discovery for malaria. And then when I came to the US to do my postdoc, that's what I was doing at Walter Reed as well.
I can tell you, the folks in our community really love when we interview folks with the background in veterinary education, and it's because we don't get enough of that. Obviously, this is most of the people, well, all the people listening to this podcast have a vector-borne disease. Generally, it is a disease that was transmitted from an animal host to a human host. So it's really important for us to get more of that foundation from folks who have your type of education. Yeah. And of course, just foreshadowing this, the building out of this interview, you did your research in malaria, and obviously malaria is a close cousin to Babesia, which is a problem here in our community. Generally, what we find is there's a big three in our community. It's Borrelia,
yep.
It's Bartonella, and it's Babesia, right? We have those three diseases together. In fact, they're together so often we've redefined Lyme disease, at least in our community, as a polymicrobial infection or post-infectious disease, because it's rarely just one strain of one bacteria. It's a combination. So it's wonderful that you did your research in malaria, and then we were blessed to have you move here to the U.S. So let's talk about the postdoc work you did, and then how that ultimately translated into the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. So I spent about 8 years at Walter Reed, and I worked on all kinds of antiparasitics for malaria. And one of the drugs I worked on was a drug called Tafenoquine, obviously in a different context for malaria.
Right.
And so later on, when I founded 60 Degrees Pharmaceuticals in 2010, and our mission then was focused on tropical drugs for tropical diseases.
Okay.
And then as we kind of cut our teeth a little bit, we became more broadly focused on infectious disease. And there was an opportunity to license Tafenoquine from the Army for malaria prevention.
Okay.
And so our company led the R&D effort and commercialization effort to get Tafenoquine approved by FDA as a drug called Aracoda in 2018.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so after that, maybe about 2 years after FDA approval, we started seeing articles in the literature about using Tafenoquine in experimental models of babesiosis.
Okay, so it was off-label use in that.
Well, this was before it even started to be used clinically. This is animal data and pretty convincing sets of efficacy studies in animal models that were reproducible every time a new investigator decided they were interested. There's probably been 4 or 5 publications now that support the original core finding. And then that motivated some treatment of patients who are immunosuppressed and have relapsing babesiosis with Tafenoquine at various doses in combination with azithromycin and atovaquone. And that got published earlier this year by a medical team from Yale. And then less formally, but consequentially, there's also been an increasing use of Tafenoquine for chronic babesiosis as an off-label use by physicians in the Lyme disease community.
So talk to us about off-label use and when do you as the I don't know if I be proper in calling a manufacturer, when do you have concerns about the off-label use, and how do you want to make sure that the off-label use becomes a, I guess, an FDA-approved use?
So I guess the first thing is we can only promote or make claims about a product for the indication that FDA approved it for.
Right.
So we only formally talk about efficacy in the context of malaria prevention. But physicians are free to use an approved product for anything that they feel there's a medical need for, and it has we don't have any involvement in that process. But at the same time, not everyone is familiar with the safety data in the way that we are, and so after we became aware of folks using it for chronic babesiosis, we started to get active in communicating a safety message around the product and making sure the basis of approval on safety was known to people in the community. As you know, there's a lot of experimental dosing with a new product, and to people figure out in the practice of medicine how it should be used. Our job is to make sure that the safety data that is known is clearly communicated. And then let's
pause there for a second, because I think it's important for folks in the community to understand the process of drug use on label versus off-label uses, right? So what happens is that there is research data developed by people like you who are research PhDs, and then that data is sent to regulatory agencies who then approve it or don't approve it. If it's approved, it then becomes a part of a generally accepted medical practice, which clinicians then use it for. But what clinicians also have the right to do is they have the right to use a medication off-label for outliers, right? So the research that you're all doing, of course, in the research community is going to be based around a bell-shaped curve, but there are going to be people who are going to fall, who are going to be outliers. And when those people are outliers, clinicians have the right within certain parameters of using something off-label, right? And the drug that your company has licensed and developed is now being used by Lyme disease doctors to treat not malaria, but Babesia. And we see that that's pretty common, that the drugs that seem to work on malaria also seem to work on Babesia, right? They're close cousins, and because they're close cousins, these drugs work. Now, you as a researcher and as a professional now want to get information out to the clinicians who are using this on the outliers. So talk to us about how you're getting that information out between now and what I'm assuming is going to be a process that you'll go through to have it approved on label.
Well, the first thing is there's varying levels of evidence that people use to make decisions.
Okay.
And the FDA obviously uses the most stringent.
As they should.
As they should. And so, as a drug company, our goal is to give them a package of data that they can use to grant a marketing approval for a new product. So, there are various sorts of data and evidence about what a drug may or may not do in a particular disease area. And in the case of babesiosis, we review the scientific literature, we hear from physicians and their experience. And then what we're trying to do is design a series of studies that generate pivotal data so that we can go to the FDA and ask for a new indication for a drug that's already approved for malaria prevention. And so that's part of the reason for coming to a conference like this is learning what the practice of medicine is, learning about the patient journey, figuring out how to do a clinical trial from a practical standpoint. Like, you can't do 20 bleeds in 3 days and expect a patient to tolerate that. So, and then what makes sense in terms of how a new drug might be used relative to other medications that are being used in a disease area. So that's part of it's a learning process. When we get to the point of starting a clinical trial program, we're going to be interested in recruiting patients for that research study. And then the other more general message is we have a pretty good idea in a healthy population what doses of our product are safe in the context of malaria prevention. And to the extent that that message can be shared from an educational perspective, it's another reason for talking to folks about, what's going on with babesiosis.
Now, you use the word marketing to describe getting the information out to the medical community about the use of the drug for Babesia. But I think it's more important than just having the ability to market, because when you're marketing or you're providing the information to the doctor community, really what you're sharing with them is that it's a generally accepted medical practice, that you're allowed to use this, and it then becomes safer for them to use it, and it's more likely that they will be using it for the patient community. So from the standpoint of the patients who are going to be listening to this podcast, what I think what's most important and what's most exciting is that it's going to be a brave doctor that's going to treat an outlier with a drug off-label. Once you get the approval, and it's going to cost you probably millions of dollars to go through the process of getting the approval, once you get the approval, how you're serving the patient community is that their doctors are going to be more likely to use this across the board, because it's then a generally accepted medical practice, and it would be safer for them professionally to provide this tool to the patient community that's desperately in need of this tool.
So definitely what we hear from patients and physicians is that Babesia is, I've heard the word exploding used in incidents.
It's absolutely exploding.
Yeah. So there's that. Existing standard of care isn't actually FDA approved for any sort of babesiosis treatment, so it's also used, it's a de facto standard of care.
Right.
It's also used off-label, but in a quite widespread manner. And then doctors who have patients in need and have made a decision to prescribe, obviously that decision is better informed if it's blessed by the FDA.
Yeah, and it's safer. I can tell you, just as a lawyer, you know, one of the things that doctors tell me all the time is that they don't like lawyers, because anytime they do something off-label or they prescribe something that is outside of the generally accepted medical practice, they're exposing themselves to a lawsuit. They're exposing themselves to a complaint from a pharmaceutical company. They're exposing themselves to licensing issues, right? And as a result, doctors are very anxious about treating Lyme patients, right? Which is why we don't have many competent Lyme disease doctors, and almost all of the doctors who are competently treating people with Lyme disease are certainly ILADS trained for sure, but they're generally outside of the insurance system. You have to step out of the insurance system, and you have to be a private pay. And I think it's work like yours. I mean, I just want you to understand how important it is from a patient standpoint that you do the work that you're doing. It's so important for you to be successful doing what you're doing, because it makes it more likely that the general physician will not only have this in their toolbox, but they'll be willing to use it and not mistreat Lyme disease patients the way, unfortunately, the general medical community is, because they feel like they have to take risks, and I don't blame doctors. Taking risks are not something that you should want to do, because they went to medical school to develop a business and provide for their families, and the last thing they want to do is find themselves in the position so many doctors here at ILADS have found themselves in, which is either dealing with issues with medical boards or finally, having to defend lawsuits.
Yeah, I obviously can't speak to this firsthand, but I do understand there's a lot of professional risk for prescribers. We have to, as a pharmaceutical company, tread a careful line too, because we're allowed to market our product for the approved indication.
Right.
We are not allowed to make claims in other diseases,
Right.
which is why what we do is an education process about safety, and then what we need to do to fill that, what we need to do from a research standpoint to fill that evidence gap that allows physicians to confidently prescribe. And, you know, when you think about it, there is no FDA-approved drug for Lyme disease. There is no FDA-approved drug for Malaria, Babesia, or Bartonella. And we are, as a company, in a unique position where we have a commercially available product where we think, well, the dose that we plan to evaluate in clinical trials is similar to the approved dose for malaria. And we hope that with more evidence and in case anyone from the FDA infectious disease division is listening, we've had a very constructive interaction with the FDA on Tafenoquine and several facets of babesiosis as a disease. I feel like FDA have been really supportive, and hopefully if that constructive engagement continues, then maybe in a couple of years we'll be able to go to an advisory committee and submit a packet and do our small piece just to make patients' lives easier.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So one of the ways we generally end this podcast, or this compressed podcast as it is to ask what the future is, and you've already anticipated that question. So your company is now working on developing the data necessary to make the submission to the FDA. And if it took 2 years for you to submit, develop the package and submit it, how long after that would it generally take for the FDA to grant approval?
So now I have to be careful because we're a listed company, and I have to make sure that my message is general.
Okay.
The kinds of studies that we're planning to do have a 12 to 24 month timeline.
Okay.
One of the studies we're doing, we've already started recruiting patients, and so we're well into it. Once you've kind of got the data in the can, for an orphan disease like babesiosis, if the FDA believes in the science and the unmet medical need, that process might take a year.
Okay.
And then, longer if there's problems. Obviously, we hope there won't be any problems and everything will go smoothly. So
when you say problems, you're talking about
data.
Talking data.
Like
okay.
They usually do an audit of the clinical sites that were involved in the studies. When we did our malaria program, we had 100 information requests in 6 months.
Wow. Ranging
from, tell us about this data point to things we had to really defend scientifically. So with a drug that's already commercially available and you're repositioning and you've started your clinical trial, it's between 24 and 36 months.
Okay.
Before you're good to go, provided your studies work and produce the data you expect them to.
Oh, great. So, Dr. Dow, I can't thank you enough for not just joining us here at the Tick Boot Camp for a compressed podcast, but for doing the great work that you're doing for the folks in the community. There is an explosion, as we know from our guests on our podcast, of this parasite, and we're seeing it more and more as part of the big three that folks are dealing with in this polymicrobial infection that they're dealing with. So I just want folks to know Dr. Dow's working for you, and he's going to get us a new tool that will hopefully help us in the very near future. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.